Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's center talk. We are very excited to have Shreyas with us, who is doing some pioneering work on platforms. I'll quickly introduce Shreyas to you. So Shreyas is a faculty member in the operations and analytics area at the Rotman School of Management, Toronto. Prior to this, he was a postdoc at the Harvard Business School. His research tackles questions pertaining to revenue management that arise in the context of online platforms, specifically in relation to understanding novel pricing models and also more on the fraud behavior part, where he makes sure that platforms are robust to strategic and fraudulent behavior. He received his doctoral degree in computer science in 2017. Also, he has received a Best Graduate Dissertation Award. He's also a recipient of many other awards, including a Best Paper Award from ACM as well as from Informs. And he has worked closely with platforms and helped them design more data-driven policies, right? And personally, he's doing some, I really like his research, the kind of work he's doing, and he's doing some awesome work in the field of platforms. We are very glad that he accepted our invite and is spending his Thursday morning with us. Shreyas, thank you so very much once again. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you then.
Anuj, I should thank you first for inviting me to be here. Thanks a lot. Very happy to be here. As Anuj mentioned, a lot of my work is on fraudulent behavior in online platforms. This work is no different. Disintermediation is something that could be viewed as an existential threat to some platforms, and maybe it's keeping several people in Silicon Valley up at night. So I think given how big a topic this is, I'm very excited to be here, excited to share our findings. And by the way, this work is brand new. It's hot off the presses. So I really appreciate your feedback. I know that your center has a lot of diverse folks from different communities. So feel free to keep those questions coming in. And at any point, if you want to interrupt me, just go ahead. Okay. Of course, a quick shout out to my co-author, Oyun Siddiq, who's a faculty member at the UCLA School of Management. I think we started working on this last summer, and it's been a pretty productive project. So quite happy to be here presenting this. Okay, so let me begin without any delay. Now, I want to begin with a quick question to the audience. How many of you here have heard of the term disintermediation, particularly in the context of online platforms? I know this is an online talk, so unfortunately I can't see you. If you want to use the Zoom feature to raise your hands, go ahead. Okay, I see Anuj's hands going up, so I know at least one person's heard of the talk. I see one or two more hands in the audience. Okay, great. Yeah, so disintermediation is basically what the name indicates. It's when you cut out the intermediary and decide to complete the transaction yourself. Now, traditionally, people have used it in the context of supply chains or cutting out real estate brokers and just dealing with the owner yourself. But I think increasingly, many of our conversations these days are centered around online platforms. And I think we all have strong opinions on how much commissions we should be paying these platforms. So keeping this in mind, I think there's been a resurgence in this topic in this context of digital platforms. So for the purpose of this talk, I want to define disintermediation as the situation that arises when a buyer and seller who are matched on the platform decide to go outside of the platform to complete their transaction. Now, why are they doing this? It's pretty obvious. Once I go outside the platform, I don't have to pay this 10 or 20% commission fees that the platforms have. So I save myself some money. Okay. Now, I have a particularly funny story about my first introduction to disintermediation. This happened when I was visiting some family in India. So we call an Uber home. This was a while ago, by the way. So while the platforms were still picking up. So we call an Uber home. This person arrives at our doorstep and tells me, hey, why don't you just cancel the ride on your app? You can subtract whatever the cancellation fee is and pay me the difference. I was actually stunned by this at that point. I guess it's pretty much more common now because, like many of us work on online marketplaces. And I know I give a lot of talks about how these online platforms enable lots of new transactions and, make buyers and sellers meet. And here's a perfect case of, a transaction that would have not been possible without Uber, but then we're perfectly happy keeping Uber, out of the commission rate. So it's kind of interesting. And I thought, okay, have I got the world's smartest Uber driver, or is there more to this phenomena than meets the eye? So I decided to dig a bit deeper into this. And what I found out is, disintermediation is something that a lot of platforms are aware of and deeply concerned about. So for example, there was this popular home cleaning platform called Homejoy, which actually completely shut down in 2016 due to a number of reasons, one of which is disintermediation. But it's also something that's received a lot of academic attention in recent years. So in particular, almost all of the work that I've seen in the last 2 years have all been empirical. And I think the reason these have been well received is that disintermediation is so hard to track in practice, right? Because it's not something that shows up in data. It's part of the unofficial offline economy. So I think getting an empirical paper to even track this phenomena is, I think, a big achievement. So let me spend the next couple of minutes maybe telling you about, what kinds of things people have found out. Now, the topic of disintermediation was first identified in the context of platforms. It is a seminal paper by Grace Gu and Feng Zhu, who ran a randomized control trial on an online labor platform and found out that disintermediation could actually be, costing them 5% of their revenue or more. Now, there was a follow-up paper by Nilkara Koglu, Ioannis Stamatopoulos, and Seaman Lee. They paint a much more dire picture. They say that, hey, this home cleaning platform that we studied could be losing up to a fourth of their transactions thanks to disintermediation. Now, following this, people have looked at platforms like Airbnb, which is going to be one of our example platforms for this work. They say that, looking at the data from Airbnb, Austin, Texas, they say that disintermediation is at least 5.4%, although the number could be much higher. By the way, these 3 papers are just the tip of the iceberg. There's been tons and tons of work on this topic in recent years. I think you invited Chiara Fornato for a talk here. I don't know if it was on this paper, but surprisingly, right, all of these papers are 21 and 22 because, this is a topic that's suddenly emerged in our collective consciousness, and now it's something that everyone cares about. So, and I see the wheels turning in your head now, and maybe some of you want to ask me, Shreyas, if this is a topic that, is so important and platforms are scared about it, why aren't they doing something about it? And you're absolutely right, okay? A lot of platforms have now implemented policies to particularly prevent disintermediation. Upwork, which by the way, is an online labor platform where, you can post jobs and people come and sign up for your jobs, actually has a strict terms of service where they say that you're not allowed to share your contact information before the contract begins. Airbnb goes one step further. So I don't know if any of you have tried sharing your phone number or email address on Airbnb, but if your reservation is not complete, Airbnb actually has algorithms to come in and prevent you from sharing these details. Okay, so that's it, right? So this is a big problem. Platforms are aware of this. They've taken steps to prevent this. End of talk. What more is there? Well, as we know, the more the platforms try to clamp down on this behavior, the more people are going to push back. So here's a lovely example of a host on Airbnb who, despite Airbnb's state-of-the-art algorithms, has found a very clever way to share their phone numbers. And our data suggests that, Shashi is not alone. There's at least 5% disintermediation on the platform and probably more. Okay, so I think the good news in 2022 or 23 is that these platforms are aware that these policies of, punitive measures to identify and punish people are actually not working. And to really counteract disintermediation, I think they all realize that, hey, this begins with understanding the incentives that people have and how do we give them more value to be on the platform. So for example, OpenBay is a platform that connects car mechanics with car owners. And the CEO, Rob Infantino, here is basically acknowledging that, disintermediation is something that keeps him up at night. And I think the way to prevent this by happening is, you really make sure that your marketplace has a lot of value so that people are incentivized to stay on OpenBay. Okay. So now, speaking of incentives, let's do a thought experiment. So I want all of you to put yourself in the shoes of a seller on these platforms. And I want you to think about, what you have to gain from disintermediating and going offline versus deciding to stay online and transact on the platform. Okay. Now, when I say seller, I want you to think of, a homeowner or a host on Airbnb or a freelancer who's on one of these platforms like Upwork, TaskRabbit, and Thumbtack. So let's work out both sides of the equation here, right? We are quantifying, we are quant people. So what happens if I go offline? Well, that part of the equation is pretty clear. If I decide to disintermediate, I don't have to pay any commission fees to the platform. I save myself some money. Yay, that's a win. Okay. However, if you do decide to go online, you miss out on some good reviews and possibly, the convenience of having a digital transaction. Okay. But more importantly, you also miss out on the protections that the platform provides you, like insurance or payment guarantees, holding money in escrow, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this is extremely important, right? So Airbnb, for example, insures the properties of all their hosts for damage up to $3 million US. So if your guest comes over and damages your property, no worries, Airbnb will cover it for you. And this is quite important. And I don't need to explain why that's the case, because if you're a buyer on these platforms, maybe this is a one-time transaction for you. And if things go wrong, that's okay. That's just the cost of doing business. Now, if you're a seller on these platforms, this is basically your livelihood, right? Imagine if someone comes and trashes your property, or if you get a client on Upwork and then they come in and string you along and refuse to pay you at the end of the day. That has significant opportunity costs and can significantly hurt you in the short and the long run. Okay, so you're considering this trade-off now as a seller. Remember the thought experiment. So do I go offline and save myself some money, or do I stay online and make sure that I get the protections that Airbnb or Upwork has to offer? Okay. Now, what is it that's going to help you balance these two factors in one way or another? Well, one thing that could help tilt the scales is how much information that I have on whether or not this buyer is reliable. Okay. In other words, if you have some information that, hey, this person is reliable, he or she is trustworthy, then maybe you're okay with going offline. Whereas if you're worried that there's some risk associated with the transaction, you want to stay on the platform. Okay. Now, I talked about the Uber example previously. So in that case, the Uber drivers probably inferred that, hey, this is a customer who's booking on the app. He's going to the airport. So I don't think he's going to go there and make a fuss about paying. So let's just go ahead and ask him to go offline. All right. So, and ironically, the information that you need to help evaluate how risky this buyer is typically provided by the platform itself. This could be in the form of reputation systems, reviews, certifications, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about information for a minute. Now, information is a double-edged sword on these platforms, right? So the traditional view in economics or operations suggests that, hey, platforms should strive to give as much information as possible to its buyers and sellers, because the more people are aware of each other, the more trust there is on the platform, which can lead to more efficient matchings. All right. But when you bring in disintermediation into the picture, some of these things can be flipped. So in particular, I talked about the seminal work by Grace Gu and Feng Zhu. They actually tried an experiment on a labor market where they shared ratings and review information with its users. And what they found out is that the more accurate this information is, the more likely people are about to disintermediate. Okay. So there's clearly a trade-off here. And one of the goals of this work is to understand this interplay. Now, let's put information aside for a minute, and let's talk about the solutions that you can have for disintermediation. So, the natural solution, which I think everyone from the venture capitalist to my grandmother are going to suggest, is, hey, the reason there's disintermediation is, your commissions are too high. Why don't you just lower the commission so that people will stay on the platform? Now, this is clearly a solution. It works, but maybe it's not a solution in the platform's best interest, because lowering the commissions can hurt their bottom lines. Okay, so what other alternative strategies exist? Now, before I go there, I actually want to convince you of why disintermediation exists in the first place. So let's talk about the timeline for a minute. So how these platforms work is usually they match a buyer and seller. Think of Uber again, right? You're matched with a driver, and you end up paying them only once the transaction is complete. Okay, so this means that by the time the payment occurs, the match is already complete, and it's too late to turn the clock and go back and undo anything. So I have all the incentive in the world to move away from the platform. Now, putting this in a little bit more of technical terms, there's a fundamental misalignment between what value the platform is providing, which is connecting a buyer and seller, with what they're pricing for, which is a completed transaction. So how do we close this gap? Okay. Now, I want you to take a look at this picture and immediately come up with, a simple way to close this gap. So why should the handshake be before the dollar sign? Why don't we just flip this order? So in particular, think of a platform that prices upfront or at the time of matching, right? Now, in this case, I've already paid the platform. So by the time I'm matched to a buyer or seller, it's too late to go back. So I really have no incentive to disintermediate. Okay. Turns out that a lot of platforms are considering pricing strategies that do look like this. So I think the most popular example is Thumbtack, which is also an online labor market like Upwork. Thumbtack charges you for leads. Lead is basically a connection between buyer and seller. You can buy up a bunch of leads upfront. Uber, by the way, has a new Go Pass in Pakistan, where they're asking drivers to pay upfront, and once they do so, they're not charging the drivers anymore for individual rides. Great. It looks like we've solved the problem. Access fees are clearly good for avoiding disintermediation. But we talked about how lowering commissions can hurt the platform's revenue. We need to know if the same is true for the access fees, right? So in particular, can the platforms lose out on revenues by switching to access fees, or is it a win-win at the end of the day? I see a comment on chat, so let me see if I can dig that up. All right. Is there a study on what is the loss from first buyer seller and how is it from second transaction onwards? Yeah, Devjit, awesome question. Good. So almost all of the studies that I've quoted before are from, almost all of them are from first buyer seller transactions. And that's one thing that we are going to consider in this work. I think it's fair to say that, subsequent transactions are only going to make things worse. Now, let me give you some context, right? So if you look at Airbnb data, the number of first-time buyers and sellers who meet is almost like more than 90%, whereas people who meet for the second or third time, especially the same person renting the same house, is actually much smaller. So I think there are a lot of platforms where a majority of the transactions are between buyers and sellers happening for the first time, and the data suggests that disintermediation is still prevalent in these platforms. If you ask me at the top of my head, I'd say that the first time disintermediation is probably around 5 to 10%. And if you see numbers like 20%, it's probably people who meet multiple times. So especially the study on the cleaning platform, I think has a lot of potential for multiple transactions because, you could call someone to clean your property once, twice, thrice. And I think when you call someone multiple times, it builds a lot of trust between this buyer and seller. Yeah, great question. Thank you for posing that. So let me talk about the research goals of this topic. So I mentioned there's been a lot of empirical work. So the one thing I think we set out to doing is, hey, can we complement this empirical work using some theory and modeling? And in particular, we want to understand the trade-offs between information and disintermediation. Okay, so this leads us to our first question. So how does information quality affect the platform revenue? In other words, a lot of platforms care about making their rating or reputation systems more informative and less noisy. Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? The second question is, clearly platforms should adjust their commission rate in response to disintermediation. In which direction is this adjustment going to be, right? Is it natural that they should lower their commission rate? Is there more to this than meets the eye? Now, third, access fees is something that a lot of people are excited about, but is it good to switch to access fees? Can the platform recover lost revenues by doing so? So those are the three questions that we're going to talk about today. I'll pause here for a minute and maybe allow the chance for more questions if anyone has. And again, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I can't look at the chat all the time. So if you just want to have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
I don't see any question yet, so I think we can continue.
All right. Okay. If everyone's happy with our setup so far, let me actually talk about the model. So again, as I said, this is a work with analytical and empirical modeling. So we're going to use theory to study how disintermediation can hurt platforms. So we consider a pretty generic platform, right? You have buyers and sellers. You can think of, Airbnb or Upwork. When I say Airbnb, the host is the seller. When I say Upwork, you can think of, the freelancers or the contractors as the seller. And pretty much think of any platforms where sellers set their own prices. Okay. Now, on the seller side, we have sellers who belong to two different quality types, high quality and low quality sellers. As you can imagine, high quality sellers produce better quality of service, and buyers are going to derive more value by transacting with these people. Okay. Now, we also assume that sellers set their own prices. Again, you can think of how things work on Airbnb, right? Different houses have different prices, and clearly the higher quality houses can have a higher price. Now, the seller side is pretty simple. The buyer side, on the other hand, buyers have two dimensions to them. So one dimension is their sensitivity to price or quality. We capture this using this parameter theta. Now, when this buyer transacts with a seller of quality Q, the value that they derive is theta multiplied by Q. Okay, pretty straightforward, nothing fancy here. Now, the part that I do want you to pay attention to is the risk profile of these buyers. So most of the buyers are nice, right? They are not people who are going to swindle you, but we do assume that a small fraction of buyers on this platform are risky. Now, risky buyers can mess things up for the seller in two ways. So first, they charge, because of transacting the risky buyer, sellers may incur an extra cost of C that was not there in an original transaction. And two, if you decide to transact offline with the risky buyer, they may actually withhold the payment. Okay. Now, I want you to think of a risky buyer as someone who's difficult to deal with. I'm sure, so people in the service industry deal with such people all the time, right? They give you ill-specified tasks. As a client, they may kind of string you along for a long time. They may make life generally miserable for you. And I think there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that it's exactly these clients who are the ones who end up not paying you properly at the end. So I think it's fair to say that, these two factors, people who end up costing you extra and people who end up withholding payment, are actually correlated to each other. Okay. So that's it for the buyer and the seller side. Let's talk about the platform's reputation or information signal. So in particular, I'm going to kind of capture this platform's reputation system as a signal sigma that the platform reveals at the buyer. So the platform reveals to each seller whether or not the buyer is risky, okay, or whether they're safe. Unfortunately, we know that most reputation systems are noisy. So to capture this, I'm going to assume that this signal sigma is only accurate with the probability alpha. Okay. Now you can think of this probability alpha as the information quality. So if alpha equals to 1, it means that the platform reveals a perfectly accurate signal about which buyer is risky and which buyer is safe. And this is clearly a platform that's operating at peak efficiency. Now, on the other hand, if alpha is 1/2, this just means a coin flip, right? Because I have absolutely no information on who's good and who's bad. I'm pretty much taking a shot in the dark here. Okay. So the one assumption I'm going to make is that I'm going to assume that alpha is not something that the platform can tune, but it's actually an exogenous parameter. So specifically, what do I mean by that? So, platforms do try to improve their reputation quality, but it's not something that they can completely adjust as per their wishes. It's something that involves a lot of work. So I'm going to assume that different platforms, are at different locations when it comes to alpha, and I'm going to see how the choice of this alpha can affect the platform's revenue. All right. So if that's clear, let's actually walk through the platform dynamics. So here's how these things work. So step 1 is that the platform announces its pricing policy. I see a question. I'll come to that in a second. So what that means is that at the beginning of our horizon, the platform steps in and says, hey, I'm going to charge a 5% commission, 10% commission, 20% commission, whatever. Now, once that happens, every seller selects a price P. Now, as you can imagine, the seller's price depends on the quality. Higher quality sellers can select a higher price. Similarly, the seller's price can also depend on the commission rate gamma. So the higher the platform's commission rate, maybe the more likely sellers are to pass this on to the buyers. Now, step 3, buyers are matched to the sellers and sellers observe what the reputation of this buyer is. Okay. Now, once this matching is complete, basically one of 3 outcomes can occur. Outcome 1 is that there's no transaction, everything falls apart, and people just go back to where they were. Outcome 2, then that's the one that's particularly relevant for this work, is that the buyer and seller together decide to disintermediate and go and complete the transaction offline now that the platform has matched them. Outcome 3 is that it's the default option, which is the buyer and seller decide to complete the transaction on the platform, right? So I decide to not cancel my Uber ride and decide to just pay through the app finally. Okay. So these are the 3 outcomes I'm going to study. In a second, I'll explain about the conditions that lead to each of these outcomes, but I'll try to look at the question first. Yeah, sigma is discrete. Thanks for asking, Anshuman. In fact, sorry, Anshuman. Sigma is just going to be R or S. So basically, the platform just reveals, is this person risky or is this person safe? You could have more types, less risky, more risky, slightly less safe, so on. All of this is fine, but it is discrete. Now, alpha is continuous, okay? So in particular, alpha is going to be between 1/2 and 1. 1/2 means it's a coin toss, 1 means it's a perfectly accurate system. So I think by varying this parameter alpha, you can kind of control sigma in a more continuous sense, if that makes sense. Okay, thanks. It's a great question. All right, so going back to the 3 outcomes, let's talk about when the buyer and seller decide to not transact. So we know that the seller observes the buyer's reputation sigma. So one case that the seller could reject the buyer is when he or she observes this is a risky buyer and there's too much uncertainty in the system over how much risk is involved. So the seller can reject this buyer completely because of this signal. Okay. Now the buyer can also reject the seller if the price is too high. So in particular, we said that, hey, theta Q is how much value the buyer derives from this transaction, and theta is different for different buyers. So this means that if your price is too high, then a buyer should just come ahead and completely reject it. Okay, so these are the conditions which lead to the no transaction situation. Now the offline transaction is a little bit more nuanced. So in particular, to disintermediate, we require that the buyer and seller go completely offline. They negotiate a new price B that may or may not depend on the price P, and both the buyer and the seller should prefer this new price P to their current price P. Okay, I'll try to establish this more formally in a minute, but these are basically the dynamics of the offline transaction. Now, the online transaction is somewhat more straightforward. It's the default option, and this works out as long as A, both the buyer and seller derive positive or non-negative utility, and B, at least one party prefers transacting online to actually going offline. Okay, so 3 outcomes: no transaction, offline transaction, online transaction. Now let me actually spend the next minute or so trying to establish what our disintermediation bargaining process looks like. But again, before that, if you have any questions at this point, feel free to post in the chat or just come and talk here. Let's see if I've answered.
I don't see any question right now, so we can actually move on.
All right, thanks, Anuj. All right, so let's spend some time trying to understand the utilities of the buyers and sellers in our platforms. So let's say that you have a buyer with a price P and a reputation signal. Now, if they decide to transact online, the seller's utility is going to be 1 minus gamma times P minus the cost of completing the transaction. Okay. So why 1 minus gamma? Because P is the price that the buyer pays the seller. Now, the platform's commission rate is gamma. You can think of gamma like 0.1. So 0.1 times the price goes to the platform. The remaining actually goes to the seller. Okay. We also talked about how to complete the task, the seller could incur a cost, and this cost is actually higher for the risky buyer. So this expected cost conditional on sigma actually captures that, hey, conditional on sigma, some buyers are risky. What's the cost that I'm incurring due to these risky buyers? Okay, so that's the cost of transacting online. Now, if you transact, a buyer transacts online, the utility is pretty simple. So theta Q is the value they derive. P is the price that they pay. So the utility is just theta Q minus P. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, let's assume that instead of transacting online at price P, they come up with a bargaining price B and they decide to transact offline. Now, what do their utilities look like? The seller's utility is a little bit more tricky. So in particular, the utility should be B minus the cost. Okay, but we talked about how risky buyers can withhold your payment offline. Again, think about trading on the platform, where the platform gives you a payment guarantee or protection, versus trading offline, whereas at the end of the day, the buyer may say, okay, your job was not good, I'm not going to pay. So to kind of capture this phenomena, by the way, this is very, very common. If you look up client not paying with respect to any platform name, you're going to find tons and tons and tons of people posting this online. So we're going to assume that risky buyers completely withhold payment online, whereas not risky buyers are willing to perfectly pay you your full amount. So this means that the seller's utility offline is the probability that this buyer is not risky. Remember, risky buyers don't pay you at all, times the payment. minus the cost. Okay. Now the buyer's utility is still very similar. The buyer pays, buyer's value is theta times Q, and their payment is B, which is the disintermediation price. So it's just the value minus the price. Okay. So far, so good. Now the only thing that's remaining for us to set up is what does this bargaining price B look like? So we're going to follow the literature here on this point, and we're going to assume that the buyer and seller use Nash bargaining to arrive on this offline price. If you don't know what Nash bargaining is, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think one simple approximation for what this looks like is you can think of the buyer and seller as both deriving some valuation, and they decide to split the surplus equally between them so that both of them kind of reap equal rewards from trading offline. Okay. Now, this assumption is not that critical to any of our results. You can kind of add more bells and whistles. So for example, you can assume that there's a 50-50 split. You can assume that the bargaining price is P minus epsilon. You can assume that sellers encounter an additional cost for going offline. Pretty much all of these work as well. The only reason I'm sticking with the very simple framework is I think the results are much more practical in this case. Okay, so that's it for the model. Let me quickly talk about a couple of assumptions that we make and maybe use this opportunity to let people interrupt me and ask questions if they have. So we talked about the platform's information signal. In particular, the signal is not perfectly accurate. It's only accurate with quality alpha. And I'm going to refer to this as the information quality or how informative the platform's reputation system is. Okay. Now, one assumption that we make is there's a lot of uncertainty associated with the buyer's risk level, but there's not much uncertainty associated with the seller's risk level. Okay. The reason we do this is if you look at a lot of these platforms like Upwork and Airbnb, the buyer's risk level, buyers have very few transactions, right? So for example, they look like 5, 6, 7 transactions, whereas the sellers on this platform transact repeatedly, so they have maybe hundreds, if not thousands of transactions. So I think there's a lot less uncertainty over the seller quality compared to the buyer quality. Now, if you don't believe that point of view, and if you think that the seller's quality Q could also be noisy, that's perfectly fine. That works as well. The only assumption that you need is that this information quality alpha is not associated with the seller's quality. Now, the second assumption that we make is that the only risk from going offline is buyer underpayment. Okay, so in other words, if you decide to disintermediate, the seller incurs this risk of not getting paid, but as far as the buyer is concerned, things are pretty hunky-dory. Okay, now again, you can add more features to this problem, like make disintermediation more risky. It's going to change the numerical results a little bit, but not by that much. The third thing I think is the question that Devjit asked me on chat, which is we consider this as a one-shot game between the buyer and seller. I think there's a couple of reasons why this makes sense. So first, on a lot of these platforms, transactions are between buyers and sellers who meet for the first time. Again, for Airbnb, that number looks like 90 to 95%. So it's fair to say that a significant proportion of this disintermediation is through this, and there is empirical data to support this. Now, second, our goal is to understand this interplay between information and disintermediation. And to do that, I think looking at the first-time transaction makes a lot more sense than looking at the second-time transaction. Okay. Now, that being said, if you care a lot about repeated transactions, I think it's only fair to say that it's only going to increase, the amount of disintermediation that takes place. So you can think of whatever results are presented here as a lower bound on how much disintermediation there actually is. Okay. So that's it for the model. Again, feel free to ask me questions at any point. I'm happy to stop and answer. And assuming there are no questions. Okay, so let's talk about our research results. Now, before we go into this dark and scary world of disintermediation, I want to talk about this happy and happy sunshine world with no disintermediation. And I want to talk about what's the role of information here. Okay, so assuming that we live in this happy world with this no disintermediation, is it actually beneficial for the platform to move from a less informative reputation system to a more informative reputation system? Okay, so that's the research question I want to start with. And this is going to provide a baseline for the rest of the talk. So our first result says absolutely. Okay, so in particular, whatever commission rate the platform wants to offer, 5%, 10%, 20%, as the platform's information quality alpha increases. Okay, so in other words, as the platform starts making its reputation system more and more informative, the platform's revenue can actually increase. So in other words, the incentives of the users who, who prefer higher quality information is actually aligned with the incentive of the platform, which wants to make more revenue. Okay, so this is the first result that we show. Now, why does this occur? So I want to talk about two effects that have been well documented in the empirical literature, called the trust and the price effects. And let's talk about how this helps us in this case. Okay, so in particular, remember the trust effect is when there's a seller and there's a risky buyer and there's a safe buyer. Now, under the trust effect, as alpha increases, the signal becomes more and more accurate. So this means that it becomes easier and easier for sellers to track risky buyers. And if you're a seller who just wants to reject a risky buyer, you can go ahead and do it. Okay. So because of this trust effect, increasing the information quality leads to more trust on the platform, which can increase the number of sellers who decide to transact on the platform. Now, the price effect is somewhat more complementary. So basically, the price that a seller offers looks like this. So we talked about how the price is increasing in quality and increasing in the commission rate gamma. Okay, but the price is also increasing in the cost that the seller faces, which is the expectation of C. Okay, now as alpha increases, the seller is more and more confident that they're transacting with a safe buyer. Okay, this means that the expected cost goes down, and with it, the overall price also goes down. Now you may think, hold up, the platform's commission is, a fixed percentage of the price. So how is the price going down actually helpful for the platform? Okay, well, as the price goes down, remember that more and more buyers enter the market because buyers participate only if theta times Q is larger than P. Okay, so even though price goes down, kind of hurts the platform kind of makes up on lost revenues in terms of volume. All right, so there are two complementary effects that come into play here. So the trust effect means that as alpha goes up, buyers are able to screen out the risky buyers better, sellers are able to screen out the risky buyers better, which leads to more sellers participating in the market. Now, the price effect is complementary. It leads to a reduction in price, which leads to a larger volume of buyers entering the market. Now, together, both these effects conspire to actually improve the platform's revenue when there is no disintermediation. Okay, so things seem great, but what happens if I throw in disintermediation to the mix, right? Are things going to improve? Are they going to get worse? They clearly are going to get worse, but how are they going to get worse, and in what conditions are they going to get worse? So before I talk about that answer, let's talk about how disintermediation actually happens on this platform. So to do that, on the x-axis, I'm plotting the information quality alpha. On the y-axis, I'm plotting the commission rate gamma, which could go from 0 to 1. Okay. Now I want to talk about what happens at different commission rates. Now, by the way, the way to think about the x-axis is you can think of different platforms as lying at different points on the scale. For example, a platform that's very informative in terms of reputation system can be all the way towards the right, whereas a platform that's less informative is somewhere towards the left. Okay, so let's take a platform and let's say that alpha equals to 0.7. So as this platform increases its commission rate on the y-axis, starting from 0, now initially, until you hit the blue line, all transactions remain on the platform, right? Intuitively, this should make sense for you. A lower commission rate means that people are more willing to stay and complete the transaction on the platform because they care about the services that the platform provides. Now, when you hit the blue point, the commission rate starts to annoy the sellers. So they decide to go offline, but not completely, okay? They decide to transact offline, but only with the safe buyers. The risky buyers are still, a bit iffy. So in the case of the risky buyers, they want to transact on the platform so that they can avail themselves of the platform's protections if something goes wrong. So in other words, until the blue line, from 0 to the blue line, all transactions happen on the platform. Now, from the blue line to the red line, some transactions happen on the platform, others happen off the platform. Okay. Now, the red line is basically the breaking point for our sellers, because once the transaction becomes so high, for example, here at 0.5, the sellers decide, okay, this is too costly. There's no way I'm paying this platform 50% of my revenue. To hell with them. Let me just go completely offline. Okay. The red line is the point when sellers are like, I'll even take a risk to transact offline, but I don't want to pay this huge commission rate the platform is offering. Okay, so any platform that wants to make a positive revenue has to operate either below the blue line or in between the blue and the red line. Now, below the blue line is when everything is online, all your buyers and sellers are on the platform. Now, in between the red and the blue is when you forego some transactions, but others happen on the platform. All right. So let me look at the question I have. Okay, Anshuman is asking, higher gamma will also increase the P. Could this crowd out some of the risky buyers since it's more expensive now and reduce the fraction lambda? Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. So, okay, one thing that I guess I wasn't explicit about is that the price P that you need to transact on the platform is actually something where you cannot price discriminate. Okay, so think of again how these platforms work. So Airbnb hosts just set a single price, right? And whether you're a risky buyer or a safe buyer, you have to pay this price P. Similarly for Upwork, right? If you go on Upwork, the sellers say, hey, my price is $30 an hour. And if you're willing to pay this, you're happy to transact with me. If you're not willing to pay, I don't want to transact with you. Okay. So the online price P is applicable to all my buyers, safe and risky. And this price cannot price discriminate. Now, where you can price discriminate is in two regions. So one, the offline price B is something that would depend on sigma, because this is something that's negotiated differently for different buyers. And two, the seller could just outright reject the buyer because sigma equal to R. Okay, so you cannot price discriminate, but you can completely reject buyers, and you can decide to set a different price for them if you decide to go offline. So to answer Anshuman's question, higher gamma will increase P, and this does crowd out buyers, but it crowds out both the safe and the risky buyers equally. Yeah, great question, Anshuman. Thank you so much. If you have any follow-up questions, please ask. Okay. So if this picture makes sense, let's actually go to the first result. So remember what we said about how in the absence of disintermediation, we are in a happy world where the platform's incentives are aligned with the user's incentives, which means increasing the information quality is beneficial for everybody. Now, what happens if you introduce disintermediation? Well, the result is flipped, but only partially. Okay. In other words, what we show is, again, for any commission rate that the platform wants to offer, the platform's revenue is decreasing, but only if alpha is larger than some threshold alpha bar. Okay. Let's actually look at this pictorially to help make sense. So again, we have information quality on the x-axis, the platform's revenue on the y-axis. The red line is a higher commission rate. The blue line is a smaller commission rate. Okay. Now, initially, as I increase alpha, the platform's commission rate increases, which you see here in the blue part of the line, it's increasing. Now, alpha bar here is close to 0.8. And once I cross this threshold, any further increase in alpha leads to a drop in revenue. Okay. We also show that this threshold alpha bar becomes smaller and smaller the higher your commission rate, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. Now, why are we getting these mixed effects here, right? And to do that, I want to go back and talk about the price effect and the trust effect. So the price effect still remains the same. So in particular, as alpha increases, the price goes down, which benefits buyers and benefits the platform as well. So far, so good. The trust effect, on the other hand, can be a little bit more tricky right now. So in particular, when alpha is small, the trust effect actually helps the platform because it leads to an increase in the platform's revenue. On the other hand, when alpha is large, the trust effect can hurt the platform because it leads to a decrease in the platform's revenue. Now, why do we get these mixed results? Let's try to understand what's happening on the platform, right? So again, remember, when alpha is small, there's less trust in the system because a lot of buyers could be risky, even those who go around masquerading as being safe. So in an environment with low trust, actually providing more trust is helpful because this leads to more sellers getting on the platform. Now, when alpha is quite high, for example, in the blue case, alpha is about 0.8. This means there's already a lot of trust in the platform, right? There's only a 20% chance that your signal is false. So in this case, increasing alpha further has this funny effect because it actually leads to more people disintermediating. So as alpha increases at that point, people are going to think, this person is pretty trustworthy. Let me just go offline and trade with them. I don't need to be on the platform. Okay. So initially increasing alpha benefits the platform. Later on, it hurts the platform. Now, the reason I like this result so much is that it's pretty nuanced, right? So we're not coming outright and saying information is bad for the platform. But what we're saying is, hey, it depends on where the platform is. So in particular, if you're a platform that's kind of operating in a low trust region like this, you should obviously go ahead and try to make your reputation system more informative. On the other hand, if you're a platform with already a very informative signal, then you want to be a little bit careful because this can have adverse consequences. Okay. I think I have another question. Let me see if I can answer them. Done. Yeah, so basically, Debjit, in answer to your question about how alpha is being varied. So alpha is a parameter between 0.5 and 1. And all I'm seeing is that as alpha increases from 0.5 to 1, how does the platform's revenue increase? Okay, so the reason as this, okay, so we talked about how alpha is the accuracy of the signal. So as alpha increases, this cost that you see here, for example, the probability that your signal is accurate is increasing. So when you compare, let's say alpha equal to 0.5 to alpha equal to 1, now at alpha equal to 1, every seller who says that they're safe will continue to be safe. On the other hand, when alpha equals 0.5, there's only a 50% chance that someone who goes around with a safe badge is actually a safe person. So for example, right, you could think of platforms as having, a verified buyer case. Now, how accurate is this verified signal? But the alpha actually captures that. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so alpha is measured in terms of, let me go back to the model, and maybe that will qualify. So just to make sure, right, Debjit, are you asking about how the reputation system translates to alpha? I just want to know what alpha is in the model. Let me explain. Which part, sorry?
So I just wanted to understand that when we are measuring information quality, then in a platform, how are we assigning that, okay, this quality is very high and this not, because probably some parameters are more important when it comes to disintermediation and some are not as much. For instance, in Airbnb, having 200 or 500 people having stayed there or having a few really wonderful feedback, that makes a much bigger difference than something else. So I just wanted to understand how is it measured?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think first order approximation, one way it's a stylistic model, right? So it's not a perfect translation, but I think the way we've been thinking about alpha is it's in some sense, it captures this gap between what's the person's true quality, how good is this place really, or how good is this buyer really, versus what's the quality that you see on the reputation system, right? So for example, you could have 500,000 reviews, but if the reputation system is still biased, then I think, there could be a gap between what the rating says and what the true quality is. So on Amazon, for example, you see lots of 5-star products. Not all of these 5-star products are perfectly 5-star. So I guess the way I want you to think about alpha is it kind of captures this gap between how good is this something really and how good is this in practice in terms of system. Now, you're perfectly right that the platform can't really measure this with accuracy. And maybe there is some gap between how alpha is measured and what alpha is really. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm not making any proclamations on what alpha is. But all I'm saying is, hey, if you're a platform that's all I want to do is try to understand the directionality of alpha, right? In other words, even if you can't measure alpha perfectly, I do want to answer the following question, which is, as my platform becomes more informative, is this helpful or is this hurtful? I don't know if that answered your question, Debjit.
Yeah, it does to an extent. Probably I'll follow up later because we're short on time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, so we talked about these two effects. Let me go to the more interesting question. Now, clearly, if the platform does not take disintermediation into account while setting its commission rate, that's a bad thing. But if you do take, if you're aware of disintermediation and you want to adjust your platform's commission rate, what does that look like? Okay, so conventional wisdom, let me call this my grandmother's wisdom, suggests that you should lower your commission rate. And this feels like a no-brainer, right? I mean, come on, people are disintermediating because the commission is so high. So you should bloody well go ahead and lower your commission rate. Now, is this conventional wisdom always correct? And as you can imagine, maybe not surprisingly, we show that this is always not the case. Okay. So in particular, what we show is that there are conditions where even if there is disintermediation happening on the platform's optimal response is to increase its commission rate. Okay. And in particular, this can happen when information quality is high and if there are many high quality sellers on the platform. Okay. Now, why does this happen? Let me try to give you some intuition. So if you set the optimal commission rate gamma star, and let's say this is the optimal commission rate in the absence of disintermediation, basically the following is going to happen. So sellers are going to transact online with risky buyers, because when it comes to risky buyers, I still value the protections that the platform gives me. Now, safe buyers are safe. They do not tend to underpay. So I can go ahead and transact offline with these buyers. Now, let's use this as a starting point, and let's see how the platform should respond to disintermediation. So basically, I only have two responses, right? I either lower my commission rate or I increase my commission rate. So let's say that the platform backs down and lowers the commission rate. Now, this seems like a win-win at first glance because all my transactions are going to happen online. So this means that the platform has not lost out on any of its transactions. This is great, but if you are in a high information quality, remember the plots with the two gammas that I showed, I have to lower my commission rate to the blue plot, which means lowering it significantly from where it was at the beginning. Okay. So in other words, if you want to lower your commission rate so that you get rid of disintermediation completely, this may require you to set a very small commission rate, which can result in a significant loss to the platform's revenue. All right. Now, on the other hand, the platform can kind of double down and say, hey, to hell with all these people who decide to go offline. I'm just going to increase my commission rate. Why don't I extract more revenue from those who do stay on the platform? Okay. And what we show is that there are some conditions under which it's actually optimal for the platform to double down and extract more revenue from the people who decide to stay on the platform. Okay. Now, one way of looking at this is an undesirable outcome. Okay. Because you're actually punishing those who are loyal to you by extracting more revenue from them. This is a bad outcome. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable. Now, another way of looking at it is, hey, these are not really the people who are loyal to you. These are actually the people who are transacting on the platform because they value the incentives of being on the platform. So in that sense, I think this is actually not a bad result. Okay. Now, let me very quickly go to the third result. I'm almost out of time. So let's talk about access fees. So we know that access fees reduce the incentives for disintermediation. That's great. But the question is, do they make up for lost revenues in particular? Okay. I'm going to skip a couple of slides just to get to the more interesting result. And what we show, I think, is something that surprised us as well. So on the one hand, when there is a risk of disintermediation, access fees do outperform commissions. That's great. On the flip side, they cannot always recover the full pre-disintermediation revenue. Okay. So let's think about how to interpret this result. So imagine you're a platform like Thumbtack. Now, initially, you're cruising along at a very high revenue point. You notice a lot of disintermediation starting to happen on the platform, and you decide to react by actually lowering your commission rate. Okay, that doesn't work out well for you. So now you switch back to access fees. Now, can the access fees get you back to the point where you're cruising along at the beginning? Our result says no. Okay, by switching out to access fees, you're probably and almost always going to lose out on some revenue, because in the revenue that you get in the absence of disintermediation with commissions is actually and almost always much higher than the revenue that you get from access fees. Okay, I think this is a pretty informative result because a lot of platforms are thinking about subscription-like models. And I think you have to be aware that you can go ahead and do your subscription. You avoid any disintermediation problems. But on the flip side, you cannot go back to your high revenue that you had at the beginning of the process. Okay, so that's it for the results. I want to spend the next 4 or 5 minutes, I'm almost out of time, actually talking about some of the real world implications of the results. And I'm going to be a bit informal here. Okay, so first, we talked about how information is a double-edged sword. So platforms care a lot about increasing the information quality. Now, this can lead to more trust and more transactions, but this can also lead to more disintermediation on the platform. I think this result comes at a particularly informative time, right? Because a lot of platforms, whether this is Upwork, Airbnb, or Amazon, are trying their best to make their reputation systems more informative. I think a lot of academics, like people again you've invited in the past, Nikhil Garg, Andre Fratkin, they're all working with these platforms to try and make this more informative, or how do we reduce the bias or the noise in their reputation system. Okay. Now, what our results say is this may not always be in the platform's best interest. Okay, so in other words, if you're a platform that's operating in a low information regime, I think it's worth the effort to do all these experiments to make your reputation systems better. But if you're already operating in a high information regime, it may actually be in your best interest to keep your review system more noisy. And I have a strong suspicion that maybe this is not the exact reason, but platforms actually prefer adding a little bit, not making your reputation systems perfect, because it increases the number of transactions that do happen on the platform for a number of reasons. Now, the second thing, and the one that is not present in this work, is that platforms almost always benefit by exaggerating the risks of bad buyers. If you go on Upwork, for example, there are all these warnings and red flags that tell you, hey, don't go offline. There are lots of scammy buyers. They can take you for a ride. They can stab you in the back. Be really careful, and so on and so forth. Now, this is actually in the platform's best benefit, because if the platform exaggerates how risky these offline transactions are, then we show in the paper that buyers are more inclined to, sellers are more inclined to stay online. Okay. Now, the second result, I think, again, is quite timely, and it talks about how platforms should think about commissions. So there's been a lot of talk about, platforms charging a very high commission fee, and people are saying, hey, your high commission fee is pretty bad to begin with. Now, disintermediation is only going to make it worse. So the only best response is for you to lower your commission rate. And I've seen a lot of experts actually say this, right? Bill Gurley, the famous venture capitalist, has a blog post called, I think, A Rake Too High, where he talks about how platforms should lower their commission rate. Now, I think this is a good take, but unfortunately, it may not be a perfect take, because in some cases, even if you account for disintermediation, the platform actually wins by charging more. And we talked about how this is an undesirable outcome, because this can result in you penalizing your most loyal users. Now, the third and the last implication is, access fees are kind of being hailed as a silver bullet. Everyone's excited about subscriptions. Everyone wants to charge up front. But what we show is you want to be a little bit careful, okay? By the very name, access fees do deny access to some buyers. And if you're a platform whose goal is to maintain a diverse pool of users, so you can characterize, you can have both high-skilled jobs and low-skilled jobs, then you want to be careful about using access fees, because it can deny access to some of your buyers, sellers. Okay, so I'll end on this note. It's almost 9 o'clock at my time. So I started out with Uber, and I'll end with Uber. So here's Anindya Ghosh, who's a faculty member at NYU, talking about the same issue, where he took an Uber, and then the Uber driver just wanted to cancel and pay the full fare. This to me feels like an example of very bad platform design, especially if your cancellation fee is much smaller than the platform's commission. It looks like it's in the driver's best interest to do this. I'll open this up for questions. The paper should be out online in a couple of days. As I said, this is brand new work. So I'd really appreciate your feedback. Even if you have a small question, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to reach out and answer. Thank you so much. Again, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Anuj and Debjit. I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shreyas. We are right on time. I don't see any questions, but I do look forward to reading the paper. I mean, whenever you post it, I'll watch out for that. And really, thank you once again for taking out time discussing this research with us. Platforms fascinates us a lot. So thank you so very much once again for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for the questions, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.